Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. So we shall consider with the new system, that is the respiratory system. Okay, so you all must be all aware about what a respiratory system is. So basically it is involved in the process of breathing. Okay, so that whatever oxygen which is needed by the body, it is taken up from the atmosphere through the respiratory system. So it will enter our body through the respiratory system. So it helps in conveying the oxygen which is present in the air. So in the form of air, you breathe in the air. Okay, so it will provide you with the supply of the oxygen which is needed by each and every cell of the body. So also the waste, the gaseous waste which is formed in the body, that is the carbon dioxide. So that is also thrown out of the body by the respiratory system. So in other words, it also acts as an excretory system through which the gaseous waste is removed out of the body. Okay, so you all must be all aware about the different parts of the respiratory system. So in this particular video we shall consider the nose, which is the first part of the respiratory system. So before going into the anatomy and the physiology of nose, let us consider the anatomy of the respiratory system. So let us see what are the different organs which are involved in this particular system. So it's a system, so it will be comprising of several organs like the nose, pharynx, that's also known as throat. Okay, so that is your nose. Okay, then the pharynx is this particular part. Then the next part is the larynx, or it is also called as voice box. So larynx is located over here. Next part is the trachea, or it is also known as windpipe. Okay, so in common terminology it is known as windpipe. So it conveys the air, that's why it is known as the windpipe. Esophagus is also referred to as food pipe because it conveys the food towards the stomach. Okay, so trachea is this one, this particular part. Next one is the bronchi. So the smaller ones, the smaller divisions of this tube-like structure are referred to as bronchi. Okay, plural. Bronchus is singular. Okay, then the next and the very important part where actually the exchange of gases takes place is the lungs. Okay, so these are the ones. We have a pair of lungs. So there are two which are present, right and the left lung. Okay, now these are the different organs which are present in the respiratory system. Now these parts of respiratory system can again be classified either according to the structure or according to the function. Okay, so let us see how these parts can be classified based on the structure. Okay, so it can be divided into two parts. Okay, just like in the in your digestive system we have seen the gastrointestinal tract which forms a tube-like structure and the accessory organs. Okay, so similarly here structurally these particular parts can be divided into upper respiratory system. Upper means what? Present towards the superior side, okay, in the upper regions. So these include organs like nose, the nasal cavity which is present within the nose, pharynx and the associated structures with these organs. Okay, so upper respiratory system, it comprises of parts up to here. Okay, so that's the upper respiratory system. the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx and the other associated structures. Then next group of organs, that is the lower respiratory system. So, this will include the larynx, trachea, bronchi and lungs. So, all the other parts, okay, inferior to this. Okay, so, it comprises of the lower respiratory system. So, it will include the larynx, trachea, the bronchi and the lungs. Okay. Now, even the respiratory system, it can be also classified functionally, okay, based on what function it is carrying out. So, accordingly it can be divided into two zones, you can call them, that is the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. Now, coming to the conducting zone. So, this mainly comprises of a series of interconnecting cavities and tubes, both outside as well as within the lungs. So, whatever tube like structure are present, so this will include the conducting zone. So, it will include the nose, the nasal cavity which is present within the nose, the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi. Bronchi divide into smaller ones, that is bronchioles. Still they divide into smaller ones, that is terminal bronchioles. So, all these bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, these are present within the lungs. Okay. So, all these structures which form a tube like structure, right from beginning from the exterior towards the lung. So, their main function is to filter, warm and moisten the air. So, as the air passes through, it will be entering into the nose. From here it will go to the pharynx, next larynx, next it will enter into the trachea, then bronchi, then bronchioles and next the terminal bronchioles. So, what is the role of these tube like structures? Is mainly to conduct the air towards the lungs. So, that is why it is known as the conducting zone. Okay. Now, you got it why it is called as conducting zone, because its role is to conduct the air towards the lungs. Okay. Then the next one is the respiratory zone. So, this mainly comprises of the tubes and the tissues which are present within the lungs. Okay. These are the structures which are present within the lungs, where exactly the exchange of the gases are taking place. Okay. So, the main area where the gaseous exchange, that is entry of oxygen into the blood and the expulsion of the carbon dioxide, it takes place. So, that particular area within the lungs, that comprises of the respiratory zone. So, this will include the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, then the alveolar sacs and the alveoli. So, these are the main sites where actually the exchange of gases will take place between the air which has been conducted towards the lungs and the blood. Okay. So, that is to do with the functional classification of the different organs of the respiratory system. Okay. Now, with this brief introduction, let us see which are the branches of the medicine which deals with this particular system, that is the respiratory system. Okay. So, a branch of medicine called the otorhinolaryngology. Otorhinolaryngology means what? Auto means the ear, rhino means the nose and laryngo means the voice box, and logy, of course, that is the study of, right. So, this is a branch of medicine which deals with the diagnosis and the treatment of diseases which are associated with these three organs, that is the ear, nose and throat. ENT all must have heard of, right? ENT specialist as you call us. Okay. So, actually the specialization, it is known as otorhinolaryngology. Apart from this, there is one more specialist known as the pulmonologist. So, pulmonologist is a specialist in diagnosis and treatment of diseases which are pertaining to the lungs. Okay. So, with this we shall begin with the first organ of the respiratory system, that is the nose. Okay. So, that is the entry point of the air into the body. Just like mouth is the entry point of the food into the digestive system. Similarly, nose is the entry point of the respiratory system through which the air actually enters our body. Actual gaseous exchange will take place within the lungs, okay, but this is the first part through which the air is breathed in. Okay. So, nose, it is a specialized organ at the entrance of the respiratory system. So, that forms the entrance of the respiratory system. Now, this particular organ nose, it is divided into external portion, okay, the one which we see externally on our face, and an internal portion. So, this internal portion, it is referred to as the nasal cavity, which is present within our nose, the cavity which is present within our nose. Okay. Now, the external nose, so that is the portion which is visible on the face, right, this one. So, this will comprise of a framework of bone and the cartilage. So, these will be covered with the muscles and skin externally, and internally it will be lined with the mucous membrane. Okay. So, as you can see that this external nose, it can be divided into several areas. The first one, there are certain numbers which are given, right, 1. So, this particular portion, it is known as the root. Okay. So, that is the superior attachment of the nose to the frontal bone. Then the second part, that is this one. So, that is the apex that forms the tip of the nose, and the third one, that is this region. So, this forms the bridge. So, that is the bony framework of the nose which is formed by the nasal bones. And the fourth part, that is this one. Okay. So, this is the external nares. Okay. So, it is also known as nostril. Okay. Singular, it is known as nares, and plurally there are 2, right. So, these are known as nares. Okay. So, that is the external opening into the nasal cavity. Okay. Now, the bony framework. So, we have seen that external nose, it comprises of a bony framework and the cartilaginous framework. Okay. So, certain regions of the nose, external nose, okay, its structure is made up of the bony framework basically, and it is covered by skin and the muscles. Okay. In certain region, it is formed by the cartilaginous framework. Okay. Now, coming to the bony framework. So, it is comprised of bones like frontal bone, this one, then the nasal bones, these are the ones, and the maxillae, these are that is the maxilla, right hand side. Okay. So, this is the bony framework. Then coming to the cartilaginous framework. So, it comprises of certain cartilages, right. So, this will comprise of the septal cartilage, that is the one. Okay. So, this will form the anterior portion of the nasal septum. Okay, nasal septum which divides your nasal cavity into two parts. Okay, the lateral nasal cartilages, the second one. Okay, that is these ones. There are two on either sides, right and left. Okay, so these are inferior to the nasal bones, just inferior to the nasal bones. These are your nasal bones. So just inferior to that are located the lateral nasal cartilages, and the third one is the alar cartilage. So this forms the portion of the walls of the nostrils. Now where are nostrils? These are the ones, right? So it forms the portion of the walls of the nostrils. So that's the alar cartilage. So these are the two framework which mainly gives the external nose its structure. That is the bony framework which is lying superiorly, and the cartilaginous framework which lies inferiorly. Okay. Now this particular cartilaginous framework of the external nose, it is flexible in nature. Okay, if you can feel your nose, okay, it's flexible in nature, right? So it moves. On the contrary, the bony framework, it will not move, right? The superior portion, this particular region, if you hold it and if you try to shake it, it will not move. Whereas this particular portion of your nose, if you can hold it and if you try to move it, it's flexible, right? That's because it comprises of the cartilage, hyaline cartilage. Okay. Now on the under surface of the external nose, there are two openings as we have seen. So these are known as external nares, because there are two openings are there. So these are also known as nostrils. Okay, singular, the one is known as nares. Okay. Now the internal structures of the external nose. Okay, so we have seen what is an external nose. So within that a cavity is located, right? So there are certain structures which are present within the external nose. So these have three main functions. Firstly, warming, moistening and filtering of the incoming air which is entering your respiratory system. Second is detecting the olfactory stimuli. What is olfactory stimuli? Yes, that's the sense of smell, right? You are able to smell, right? Because the air, if it contains the odor, your olfactory system, it will detect it, right? So that's also one of the functions of the internal structures of the external nose. Okay. Then one more function is modifying of the speech vibrations. So as they pass through the different areas within this external nose, so these hollow spaces, they will act like resonating chambers. So that's why variations in the voice is possible, or variations in the speech is possible. Okay. Now coming to the internal structures of the nose. Okay, now there is a nasal cavity which is present, okay, within the skull. So there is a large space in the anterior aspects of the skull, and that is known as the nasal cavity. So this will lie just inferior to the nasal bone and superior to the oral cavity. Now where is the oral cavity? That's your oral cavity is what we have seen in the digestive system. Okay, so just superior to that lies the nasal cavity. So this again, the nasal cavity, it is lined by muscles and the mucous membrane internally. Now, anteriorly this particular nasal cavity, it merges with the external nose, right. So, that is your external nose, this one, this part. So, this nasal cavity anteriorly, that is the front side, it will merge with the external nose, and posteriorly, that is the back side, this nasal cavity, it will communicate with the pharynx. Okay. So, pharynx, that is the next part. So, that is the first portion of the pharynx, that is nasopharynx, correct. Okay. So, this particular part. Okay. So, that is the beginning of the pharynx. So, it will communicate with the next part, that is pharynx, through openings. There are two openings on either side. There are two, right, two nostrils. So, entirely your nasal cavity will be divided into two portions. Okay. So, through these two openings called as the internal nares. Nares means plural, because there are two, or these are also known as conchae. Okay. So, this is the opening of the nasal cavity into the pharynx. So, that opening, it is known as the internal nares. Okay. Now, apart from this, there are several ducts which also open into the nasal cavity. So, you all must have come across this particular picture when you have studied your skeletal system. Okay. So, there are certain ducts which open into the nasal cavity and they secrete certain secretions. Okay. So, there are paranasal sinuses. So, these will drain the mucus, and the nasolacrimal ducts which will drain the tears into the nasal cavity. See, when you are crying, what happens? Your nose starts running, right? Why that happens? That is because of all these drainage, it increases. Okay. So, there are sinuses. Now, what are sinuses? These are wide spaces which are present within these bones. You must have studied about this. So, within a specific type of bone, wide cavities are present. So, this particular cavity, that is the frontal sinus. So, it is present in the frontal bone. Okay. This one, it is the sphenoidal sinus. So, it will be present within the which bone? Sphenoid bone. Okay. So, there are large cavities within the bones which will produce the mucus, and that will be drained into the nasal cavity, as you can see. That is the opening of the maxillary sinus. Okay. Then opening of the ethmoidal cells. Okay. Opening of the sphenoidal sinus, and so on. Also, there is opening of the nasolacrimal duct, that is over here. Okay. So, the mucus which is produced over here, or the tears, this will be conveyed into the nasal cavity through these ducts. Okay. So, these are the bones of the skull which are containing the paranasal sinuses, that is the frontal bone, sphenoid bone, ethmoid bone, and the maxillae, as we have seen several openings. Okay. Now, as we have seen that they produce the mucus and it is secreted within the nasal cavity, right. Now, apart from that, these sinuses also serve as resonating chambers. So, it will help us to vary these sounds. Say for example, when we speak or when we sing. So, it will help in that variation of the sound, that is because of these paranasal sinuses. Okay. Now, the lateral walls of the internal nose. So that is formed by several bones. So you all must have studied about these bones of the skull, that is the ethmoid bone. Okay, so ethmoid bone which is located over here, this one. Then the maxillae, that is the one. The lacrimal bone, that is the one. Okay, then the palatine bone, this is the one. Okay, and the inferior nasal conchae bones. So this we will consider these inferior nasal conchae again in detail. Okay, so these are the different bones which form the lateral walls of the internal nose. Apart from that, the ethmoid bone, it also forms the roof of the nasal cavity, the top of it. So it is formed by the ethmoid bone. Okay. Apart from that, the palatine bones and the palatine process of the maxillae. So these forms the hard palate. Together it is known as the hard palate. That is the one. That is the palatine bone, and this is the palatine process of the maxilla. Maxillae means plural, there are two. Okay, so together they form the hard palate. Remember the hard palate also forms the roof of the oral cavity, right? Okay, it forms the roof of the oral cavity which is present over here. So it forms the roof of the oral cavity. The nasal cavity, it is located just superior to the oral cavity. So this same structure, that is hard palate, it will also form the floor of the internal nose, the hard palate, which comprises of the palatine bones and the palatine processes of the maxillae. Okay. Now what is the role of all these bony and the cartilaginous framework of the nose? This will help in keeping the vestibule. Vestibule, it is the cavity which is present within the external nose, and the nasal cavity, the cavity which is present within the internal nose. So both these are kept patent, that is, these are kept open or unobstructed. Imagine what will happen if they are collapsible. If they collapse, what will happen? You will not be able to breathe, right? So these frameworks, they help in keeping these cavities patent so that they do not close off, so that there is continuous movement of the air in and out through these cavities. Okay. Now this nasal cavity, it is divided into inferior portion, that is known as the respiratory region, and a superior portion, that is known as the olfactory region. Okay, so lower regions are known as the respiratory region. So mainly it is involved in the respiration, that is in the breathing, whereas the superior portions, that is upward, those regions are mainly known as olfactory regions. So these are involved in the olfaction, that is sense of smell. Okay, now this respiratory region, it is lined by the cells like pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium within the mucosa. So this will also comprise of a number of goblet cells. Now what is the role of goblet cells? That is to produce the mucus. So this epithelium, okay, which is lining the respiratory region, which comprises of the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells and the goblet cells, that is known as the respiratory epithelium, the one which is lining the respiratory region. There are two, right? Nasal cavity can be divided into respiratory region and the olfactory region. So, lower regions, the epithelium which is lining this respiratory region, it is called as the respiratory epithelium. And the anterior portion of the nasal cavity, that is your nasal cavity, right? So, the anterior portion, that is in front of it, just inside the nostrils, that particular area, it is known as nasal vestibule, which is surrounded by the cartilage, this region. And the superior portions of this nasal cavity, it is surrounded by the bony framework, right, over here. Cartilage is present somewhere over here. So, within the cartilage, the cavity which is present, that is called as the nasal vestibule. Now, within this nasal cavity are present several partitioning structures, so that the surface area can be increased. Okay, so, there is first of all a vertical partition called as the nasal septum. This divides the nasal cavity into right and the left side. So, nasal cavity is totally divided into two portions. That is by the nasal septum. Now, the anterior portion of this nasal septum, it consists of the hyaline cartilage. So, this cartilage is attached to this nasal septum, and the remainder, it is formed by the vomer, perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, maxillae and the palatine bones. Okay, so, all these structures, they provide a firm base for the nasal cavity, and it divides it into two main portions, the septum, the nasal septum, that is the one, the middle portion. So, it is dividing it into two halves, this one and this one. So, when air enters the nostrils, so it will first pass through the vestibule, right? Vestibule is the cavity which is covered by the cartilage. Okay. So, it is lined by skin and also contains coarse hairs. So, this will help in filtering out the dust particles. So, that is the protective function, right. So, it is preventing any dust particles from entering your respiratory tract. Then, apart from this, there are three shells which are formed by projections of the superior, medial and the inferior nasal conchae. So, there are three more structures which are projecting within this particular cavity. So, these are the superior nasal conchae. So, there are two on either sides, right. So, that is the one, superior nasal concha, then the middle nasal concha and the inferior nasal concha. So, similarly, the structures will be present on the other sides also. So, these conchae, these almost reach the nasal septum, right, we have seen. So, it will subdivide each side of your nasal cavity. The nasal septum, it divides it into two parts, right, the nasal cavity. Again, these conchae, it subdivides each side of the nasal cavity into a series of groove-like passageways. So, these are the superior, middle and the inferior meatuses. These are the ones. So, that is the superior, this one is the middle and this one is the inferior nasal meatuses. So, three groove like structures are produced within the nasal cavity. Now, what is the meaning of this word meatus? That means openings or passages. Okay, so these structures, these are lined by the mucous membrane. Even the nasal cavity along with the conchae, it is lined by the mucous membranes. Now, all these arrangements of the conchae are the structures which divides it into different areas or groups called as meatuses. So, this particular arrangement, it increases the surface area. So, it will help in increasing the surface area of the internal nose and also prevents the dehydration by trapping the water droplets during the exhalation. Otherwise, what will happen? Dryness will be produced, right. So, it will result in irritation in the nasal passages. So, also as the inhaled air, it whirls around this conchae and meatuses, it will be warmed by the blood which is passing through the capillaries which are present within the mucous membrane. In addition to that, the mucus which is secreted by the goblet cells. Remember the goblet cells in the respiratory epithelium. So, it produces the mucus, right. So, it again helps in moistening the air. Also, it helps in trapping the dust particles. So, again that is the protective function, right. The mucus, it helps in trapping the dust particles so that they do not enter your lungs. So, also the drainage of the nasolacrimal ducts. So, these again help in moistening the air. Even the secretions from the paranasal sinuses, these will also help in moistening the air. Apart from that, the cilia also are present. So, cilia, what is the function of the cilia? They beat, right, in a specific direction. So, they will help in moving this mucus along with the trapped dust particle towards the pharynx, which is the next part of the respiratory system. So, as a result of this, what will happen? Whatever foreign substances have been trapped within your nasal cavity, that will enter into the pharynx. So, now here on what can happen? Either it can be swallowed or it can be spitted out. So, again it is a protective function. So, it is helping in removal of this particular particle so that they do not enter into the respiratory tract. Otherwise, what will happen? They will enter into the respiratory tract and it can result in infections. So, these are all the protective arrangements which are made within the nasal cavity. Okay. Then, apart from this, the superior region, it comprises of the olfactory region, right. Inferior portions, it comprises of the respiratory region, which is lined by respiratory epithelium. Now, the superior portions, it is comprising of the olfactory region, okay. So, this lies near the superior nasal conchae, that is over here, and the adjacent septum. So, it comprises of the olfactory receptors, supporting cells and the basal cells. So, these are present in this particular region. So, these cells together comprises of the olfactory epithelium. Okay, so, this particular olfactory epithelium, so this will also contain the cilia, but here the goblet cells are absent. So, no production of the mucus. So, these goblet cells, where they are present? They are present in the respiratory region, that is in the lower portions. But over here goblet cells are absent. So, this particular olfactory epithelium, what it will be involved in? Yes, that is, it is involved in the olfaction, that is the sense of smell. Okay. So, this is to do with the first part of the respiratory system, that is the nose. So, we have seen that the external nose and the internal nose, these are the two portions into which the nose can be divided into. So, the one which is seen externally, that is called as the external nose, and the ones which is present within the skull, that is called as the nasal cavity, that is the internal nose, and it can be divided into two parts by the nasal septum. And the external nose, it comprises of the bony framework and the cartilaginous framework, which helps in giving it its structure. And within the nasal cavity, that is within the internal nose, again there are separate cells which are formed by the conchae, and also there are several protective arrangements also which help in the prevention from any dust particles from entering into your respiratory tract. Okay. So, this is the reference. We shall consider with the pharynx in the next video. Thank you for watching.